Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology. Today I'm going to talk about unified consciousness as the basis of magic, or the source of magic. One thing that's important to keep in mind as we're going through this and any kind of discussions about, how magic works or what's going on or astrology or whatever, is that we're always modeling. Anybody that thinks they have the truth, that they have the one objective correct answer, doesn't know what they're talking about. And there's lots of different models, and partly people can say, well, what's the point of worrying about this theoretical stuff? It's like, because it really impacts how you do your magic. I mean, if it's not possible within your model, you're not going to be able to do it. If it doesn't make sense within your worldview, you're either not going to do it or you're going to be acting illogically, inconsistently. And so really everything we do as an astrologer or magician is conditioned by the models and worldview that we're adopting for it. So I think the predominant model, if you're looking at astrological magic, I think the predominant model for how to, for thinking about what talismans are and what you're doing with them is a battery. So, basically and I think there's people that actually believe that it's electrical or magnetic or something, which talismans are definitely not. I mean, if you took it to a scientist and they tested it, they would say it's absolutely useless. And it would be from a standard atheistic materialistic model that looks only at matter and energy, the electromagnetic spectrum. So there's no detectable scientific energy with the talismans, and it clearly doesn't work that way. So the view is it's some kind of spiritual energy. It's like energy, but it's not detectable. So what that means is, like I said, you have a battery. It's this physical thing. It's inert. It's dead, separate thing. And it's there for you to use. You can do whatever you want with it. You can throw it away. You can use it as you want. You can give it to somebody else, transfer it around. It's just a dead object. And what you do, like a battery, is you charge it up, with some kind of planetary energy or star or whatever you're dealing with, and then it radiates that energy out. And so that explains why you have to carry it with you. You have to, and I'm not sure exactly why it needs to be next to your skin. I mean, that seems to be universal. Everyone's like, it has to be next to your skin. I mean, my model doesn't follow that, but that seems to be pretty. But that would go along with the energy idea that's like something's radiating out of it, the power's coming out of it. You have to have it with you. You have to wear it. You have to carry it, whatever. And then periodically you have to recharge it. And like I said, if you're done with it, you throw it away. You don't need it anymore. If you want to give it to somebody else, you can give it to somebody else. So that's the basic model, and that basically conditions the approach that most people have. Now that again flows from atheistic materialism. There's nothing but matter and energy. Obviously, the causality of magic must be some kind of energy. It just hasn't been discovered yet. It's scientific, and that's because what else could it be? It's impossible for it to be anything else. So the older model that you do see from time to time, and this comes from essentially from the sort of Solomonic Grimoire tradition, but it's a pretty typical approach, but like I said, epitomized by the Solomonic Grimoires, is that what you're dealing with magically are spirits of various kinds. It could be angels, it could be demons, it could be jinn, it could be daemons or whatever. And essentially what you're doing is you're forcing them to comply. Use all these powerful names of God or whatever, and you bind them and you force them and you make them do what you want. Alternatively, you can also make a deal, a sort of pact with the devil. That's another way of handling. So those are your sort of predominant models. But the battery, I think, is number one. You do have a certain amount of people doing the binding or forcing spirits to do stuff. There are alternative models. And again, I don't want to say that, obviously I prefer my model, but that's just like I prefer vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream. It's just personal to me. It doesn't mean it's right or the only right answer. It's right for me, you know. And so the other models are both traditional, occult virtue, and then the friendship or veneration of spiritual beings. So occult virtue, it's a little more natural magic, a little more automatic. Um, and that's a very Neoplatonic Hermetic view. Essentially, the Platonic ideas of the ultimate form of things, the ultimate relationship, the ultimate essence of things, is reflected in different depending on how you're interfacing with them. In God, it's unified and perfect. In the mind of God, or the mind of the one, it's differentiated but still perfect. So archangelic, Platonic ideas, the archetypes. That's another way of looking at it. It appears in the celestial realm, and then in the Anima Mundi, the soul of the world, and then in individual things, material things, but also in images, in ratios, in mantra, things like that. Um, so, and then again, there's also, like I said, the friendship or veneration. So it's like if you approach the talisman, and this is typically my approach with talismans, is to look at them as like having the cell phone number of the particular celestial angel or spirit that's associated with the talisman. So if you have a sun talisman, you have this really easy connection to the sun, the spirit of the sun, the archangel of the sun. And then what you do with it is that you do consecrations, you do invocations, you interact, you form this relationship, and then that's the purpose of it. Now, you can get benefits from it, but there's a lot to be gained just from having the friendship with the spirit. So again, these are all different possible models. I wanted to talk about an additional model. This is sort of modern. It has traditional roots, but I think it's something that people can relate to, from a modern standpoint, which is this idea of magic as resulting from unified consciousness. And this, just for this video, the impetus for it was I read this New York Times Magazine article, and it was all about microbes. So there's all these, bacteria and one-celled things and all sorts of, tiny little creatures that permeate the earth down to a really deep level. And some of them are like, in the dark, and 200 degrees, whatever, 15,000 feet below the earth, and they, instead of breathing oxygen, they use sulfur, So, but basically there's life totally permeating the physical earth, and not just on the surface as we think about it, but it's essentially full of this. And then that got me thinking about the fact that, and they mentioned this, that you think of a tree, the living part of the tree is basically just this thin layer. You have bark on the outside, and you have this sort of lignin on the inside. Both of those are sort of like bones. And so you have this mix of what apparently seems to be alive and non-living. So like I said, the bark and the trunk. Same thing with a human being. If you think about the living part of us, the bones, they're sort of alive, but they're also crystallized. Calcium, hair, it's not alive anymore. Keratin. The skin, there's a dead skin layer. So we really, what we think of as a living being is a combination of a quote, living portion and a non-living portion. And then there's also this view of, life blending into what does it mean to be alive? It's a very diffuse boundary. If you think of life is typically, a living thing has a unified form, and it reproduces and it seeks to continue. You think about fire. I mean, fire has a form. It feeds, it grows, is alive. Crystals are similar to that. They have this, they have a crystalline structure. They grow. So it's not, there's not this strict boundary between life and non-life, even in terms of a living thing. And a living thing is also a combination of quote, living parts and unliving parts. So the next step beyond that is this whole Gaia hypothesis. And the scientists have kind of don't like that. But this idea that the earth itself is a unified living being, and it has these homeostatic processes. And climate change, is a good example. I mean, whatever your political views are of it, this is actually a natural process. If you think about, there's something called the Great Oxygenation Event. About 2 billion years ago, all these anaerobic bacteria, basically they didn't need oxygen. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and they didn't use oxygen for their life processes. And they basically evolved or discovered or decided to photosynthesize, started doing photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is, they can use directly change solar energy into carbohydrates. So that was great. They just reproduced like crazy. But the byproduct of the photosynthesis is the production of oxygen. And so for millions and millions of years, oxygen got caught up in the iron and was taken up by natural processes. But after a while, there was too much oxygen, and it started to build up in the atmosphere. So they got more and more and more oxygen, and that killed off all the anaerobic bacteria for the most part. And so now we have an oxygen-based atmosphere, but that's all organically produced. And so these processes of change and of homeostasis, which is basically internal regulation of things, does appear to take place on the Earth. And so the climate change is a lot like this is a warming event, and those have happened before. I mean, typically they're going to be caused by volcanoes or something, or gas into the atmosphere. But humans are part of the natural process, so it's really not unnatural in a way. And probably the last time, I think the end Permian extinction is similar to this in terms of giving off all the CO2 and greenhouse gases, and the Earth recovered from, let's say, 10 to 30 million years. So again, probably the human caused stuff. If you don't have to buy into that, I'm not pushing that, but I'm just putting it out there for people that as a way of as an illumination. The Earth is gonna be able to respond and going back into balance. And so this whole Gaia hypothesis, like I said, is that the Earth is one unified living being, and the individual, what we see as an individual, animal or person or whatever within that is like a cell, within your body. So that's very interesting, and of course, then the corollary for if you're not having an atheistic materialistic approach would be that there's an Earth spirit, and so it's a connected spirit. And I think that's, like I said, the next step is to go and say, okay, so let's take this a bit further. And if we've got this, every living thing and everything has a spirit, has a consciousness that's part of this unified spiritual consciousness. And again, I'm not putting this out there as an argument. If it doesn't appeal to you, if it doesn't kind of click with you, then don't worry about it. If it does click, though, if it says, oh, that makes sense to me, or that's a way of understanding it, that's useful. But I'm not, it's not a debate and not an argument. So if we see this, everything is having a spirit, this quote, animism, which is a very, I think, derogatory term, but a typical traditional approach, many traditional societies had the view that everything was alive. And if we take that further and say if everything's individually alive, then also everything's collectively alive, this unified spirit consciousness. It's a very sort of Buddhist approach. And so we have this shift from a focus on individual separate material things and individuals, again, everything's an individual, to a unified consciousness. That being said, even though there's unified consciousness, there's still this diversity within unity. And what the mage does is to trace these interconnections of things, to see the differentiated unity, and then to act within it. So it's not just seeing the underlying nature of reality, but actually acting in it positively without blowback. If you do something and you don't understand what's going on and you have a horrible reaction to it, then that's obviously not a very wise thing. But if you can step in and at the right moment say the right thing, and all of a sudden things go smoothly, or just like, it's interesting, the Centiloquium, which is a series of aphorisms, sort of pithy sayings attributed to Ptolemy, one of them very early on says that the astrological magic is like gardening. And it really is. I mean, I've really gotten into gardening recently, and it's all about aligning yourself with the cycles. For example, I needed to plant some new grass, and you got to wait until the soil temperature is basically above 50 degrees. But then if it gets too hot, then you're not going to, it's going to be too much for the young grass. And then so you have to plant it during this, there's a window that you can choose, you plant, and then you have to make sure that the soil stays moist. And so if you follow that, I mean, I've got some great grasses growing like crazy, and so you have to basically align yourself and orient yourself, understand the natural processes. But if I wasn't out there choosing the time, getting the grass seed in there, preparing the soil, doing all the stuff, it wouldn't happen. So I think that's a really great analogy for astrological magic, because this is essentially orientation and cooperation, and that allows you to create these incredible effects, or have these incredible relationships. So if we think about the mechanism of connection, it's interesting because, again, the focus, if you're coming from a battery model, an atheistic material model, is on a material object. And so the magic to the person, under that view, is going to be in the talisman itself. and they're also going to be very obsessed with the materials. And that's something people are always asking me. They'll look at, for example, the Greater Key of Solomon, the Pentacles, and there's a list in there of the appropriate metals, for the talismans, and like, why aren't you using those metals? They drop the fact that you have parchment, and you can make it on the everything on the planetary hour of Mercury. They forget about that. They also forget about the super elaborate ritual, because that doesn't click with them. But what clicks with them is that you have to have the appropriate material, because that makes sense. The material object is the source of the magic, and the material that's made out of, obviously, that has to create the magic. What else could it be? Energy, like I said. So what doesn't make a lot of sense, though, in an atheistic material or energetic approach, is the image magic. And so I've always been really drawn to that. Why would image magic have anything to do with the energy? A different picture, why would that have a different energetic, you could say energetic signature, but that again doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to what the causality is. If you get into a consciousness approach, though, then you can see how it's very much more important. Because in a consciousness approach, the images are really key. Aristotle says that the soul speaks in images. So in other words, there's this communication back and forth between the ego, the conscious mind, and then the soul that takes place using images. So for example, if you have a dream, this is a communication of the soul. Not always, but oftentimes a communication of the soul. And it takes place in an image basis. That's often telling you something. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're just having an anxiety dream or something that's kind of recapitulating the daily stuff. But you will have these situations where it does seem like you're getting this communication. It could be external or internal. And that's going to take place, I said, by images. Same thing with the communication to the soul. And that's what advertising is. This is a communication, and it touches people very strongly. The combination of the music and images is very evocative, can be in a positive or a negative way. As I said, the individual focus of the use of this image magic, advertising and marketing, these are classic magical. We don't think of them as magic, but they are in fact magical. So if we think of it on a unified focus, we have a mechanism for the individual soul to communicate with the Anima Mundi, with the soul of the world. And so when you have an artist, Nigel Jackson, who was one of the early artists that I work with, he really emphasized the fact that he felt like that he was a conduit for the Anima Mundi, that the images that he created were not coming from his ego self, were not coming from him, but that he was merely manifesting them. He was obviously his style and his approach and his background and everything is going to have an influence on how they manifest. But nevertheless, the ultimate source of these images was from the Anima Mundi. And so, again, we can use that in reverse. His images are wonderful for that. All the images that I have, I think, are useful for that. Once we have the image, then we can interact with the Anima Mundi, and we can have the communication, and we can have this orientation. And so, as I said, when you think about the image descriptions for talismans, it doesn't fit in your energy model. It doesn't fit in a battery model. It really doesn't make any sense at all. And I think people do it because, well, the book says you have to do it, so they do it. But if they thought about it, I don't think they would be able to come up with an idea for it. And part of that comes also from this sort of deconstructivist idea. Everything's conventional, everything's made up. A stop sign or red lights. These are a good example of it. I think that the typical modern approach is like, oh, that's just arbitrary. We could all change. It's like, no, we can't actually all change it. And it actually really does affect you directly. If you see a stop sign, you stop. There's almost not even have to think about it. Same thing with a red light. You're at a traffic light and it turns red. You're gonna almost automatically stop. And that's not arbitrary in the sense that you can't change that anymore. You say, oh, we could do that. It's like, I have a good example for that. If in the movie The Last Emperor, which is about basically the last emperor of China and his life all the way through, and he actually lived up through the Cultural Revolution. And I noticed this is at 3 hours and 24 minutes of the movie. During the Cultural Revolution, everyone's on their bike, this is in Beijing, and they're waiting for the light to change. And it changes and it turns red, and they go. And it's really interesting because, in the Communist Party at that time in the Cultural Revolution, they were really focused on red being good. And then this slogan of, redder than the red rising sun, Chairman Mao. So, of course, that red could not be stopped. That just, that's very simple-minded, approach. It's like red obviously has to be good, at red has to go. But I checked recently, I was looking at, this online thing. I said, well, I wonder what they do in China now as far as stoplights. And China's just like everybody else. It's go on green, stop on red. That was so closely ingrained, so powerful that, that they went right after the Cultural Revolution, they went back to the standard model. So I really don't think you can say that that stop, is arbitrary. It's so culturally ingrained. It's so powerful. It's not possible. And it's also, like I said, a good example. I mean, maybe you could eventually change it, but it's, I think, a good example of the deconstructivist. There's something deeper to it too. Um, and so the image itself causes a change in consciousness. And it's, like I said, in a mundane sense, it's very efficient. Red go. You can get it communicates very clearly. And then when you talk about an image, it's like an image speaks 1,000 words. You pack a lot of information into an image. It's very useful, like I said, in terms of conveying information. And it's also can be very affect you emotionally. I mean, I was just looking at the raising the flag, the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. And that's super emotional. I mean, it may or may not punch your buttons, depends on how, if you're an American or how patriotic you are or whatever, your political stuff. But for people that are, that image speaks to, it's a very powerful image. And so, I think that that's, again, one of the things that's really drawn me to the image magic. One of the reasons I really focus on having images on my talismans. And, I think and it's very powerful. So again, one way to think about it would be the images would be, as I said, an embodiment of occult virtue. Is that the image itself is like I said, it's connected to the essence of the Platonic idea that represents. But if you do an image of love, you have a couple holding hands. I mean, that's directly manifesting that Platonic idea of love, and you can think of it as transformative. And that's another thing too, is that one of the reasons I like the image magic and the devotional approach is that, like I said, you have an image of love. It awakens love within you. It's transformative of yourself. It orients you towards love. It aligns you with the current of love, both externally and internally, as opposed to just a mechanism for, okay, I want my boyfriend back, so I'm going to make this picture. And what the connection there and how that actually works is rather vague. It's magic. It works without even having to do anything. But like I said, this idea that this image is connected and then it's a transformative image, I think is really something that we can work with and use in a practical way. And again, a reason to if it works for you, to be looking at the devotional approach and image magic. So again, you could think of it as, in a sense, if you show this image to consciousness, like I said, part of the ritual that I have people go through in the invocation with one of my talismans is that they get a card, like a postcard, that has a larger image that's either the same as the talisman or more elaborate or relates to it. But anyhow, they're in a similar vein. And then you look at that image and you just contemplate it and allow it to rest in your consciousness. And then by doing that, you're connecting yourself, like I said, directly to the Anima Mundi and to that archetypal image and archetypal consciousness that this manifests in the Anima Mundi. And so in a sense, you could say it's automatic. If you do a certain ritual or you present a certain image to consciousness, it's going to have an automatic response. In another sense, you could think of it as being personal. You're connecting to the celestial being or the angel or whatever that is the embodiment, of that particular image or occult virtue. And in this case, we're using an astrological interface. I mean, you could do lots of different ways of connecting to it. The astrological interface is I think, very powerful. You're doing an election, either for the creation of the talisman or just like a one-factor election for, say, for the daily planetary practice, or for the doing planetary charity. You do a ritual, you do contemplation of this particular image, and so talismans are actually very useful in this because they're very concrete and very evocative, and having been made at the appropriate time, they're very strongly connected and allow us to have a really excellent conduit for that. So I just think it's useful to see these alternative models and how they kind of play out. The consciousness is something that's a lot easier for modern people to kind of relate to. I mean, there's nothing that's really more immediate to us than our awareness. I mean, there's a way, even if you say the question of the existence of the I, as is typical in Buddhism, there's clearly awareness. I mean, that's the most obvious thing to us at any particular time. And so if we work with that and try to understand it or put our consciousness on consciousness itself is a typical Buddhist approach, it's a meditative or contemplative approach, then we see all this underlying connection. And so if you find that useful as a model, I think it's something to work with. We've got a lot of support for it from our traditional sources and, like I said, traditional philosophy and spiritual practices. And as well, we've got a practical thing that can be done with it, which is to create talismans and to have these effects. But if we have a consciousness-based understanding, essentially what we're realizing is that everything is connected, and more than that, everything is unified. And this diversity that exists is a mechanism for achieving unity in a sense. And so I think that that's, like I said, if you find that useful, it's I think, a very interesting approach. It's certainly, I'm finding myself increasingly drawn to, like I said, this consciousness-based approach. And so at the same time, like I said, I can follow the spiritual path and then recognize these practical implications for the practical actually application of it. Like I said, if you want love, do a Venus talisman. And rather than beams coming out and grabbing somebody and forcing them to do what you want, and you can see yourself as aligning yourself with that current of love, transforming yourself into a more loving person, opening yourself to the ability to receive love, and then that's going to, I think, be in the long run more effective than some sort of coercive spell to get a particular person. I mean, that can work, but it would have to be, it may or may not work for a specific person. And also, if it's coercive or you're like essentially forcing them to do stuff that they don't want to do, you kind of have to question that, whether you want to do that. So I think, like I said, lots of positive possibilities with it, and it gives us this underlying view as opposed to going out and having a basically unconscious atheistic materialistic view. Nothing exists except matter and energy, and then I'm trying to do magic on top of it, and then it's a battery and doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it. You've got a way of understanding this, and it also is very useful for creativity. I mean, I find myself always coming up with new ideas of how to operate. So again, if you're interested in the devotional approach, check out my Celestial Way. But I think, like I said, this idea of unified consciousness and unity and diversity and the use of image magic is a very interesting way, an interesting approach. And if it resonates with you, I hope that's something that you'll pursue.